As the relationship between the U.S. and China gets increasingly tense, both countries are turning to economic tools as a core part of foreign policy. But the U.S. lacks a clear strategy on how and when to deploy those measures in response to crises. That's according to Emily Kilcrease, Director for the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Emily, welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
In your report, you use the term coercive economic statecraft. Can you give us an example of what that means?
Sure. So coercive economic statecraft is basically any time a country is trying to exploit its position in the global economy for geopolitical ends. So one example that hit the mainstream attention was back in 2019 when the NBA got caught up in some economic coercion. There was a tweet from a Houston Rockets general manager about the Hong Kong protest. And immediately the response from China was swift and jeopardized the NBA's position in the very lucrative China market. So it's a great example of how China in particular can leverage the heft of its markets to pursue political objectives.
Yeah, and the New York Times also had a recent article, not just the NBA, but a lot of American institutions are silencing themselves and self-censoring in order to gain economic access to China. That's economic coercion, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And look, American companies trying to operate in China are in a really difficult position. It's the world's second largest economy, a huge market for U.S. companies trying to sell into that market, to that growing and large consumer base. At the same time, they're not at liberty to express concern about China's human rights abuses, concerns about China's political system. And so we are seeing a lot of companies who are trying to stay out of it or stay quiet. Otherwise, they're jeopardizing their access to this really profitable market.
So one recommendation in your report is for the U.S. to work with partner countries to apply joint pressure and not work alone. Are other countries going to be willing to risk retaliation by China? What do you think?
It's a good question, and it's quite complicated. I mean, a lot of countries, and this is something we saw in our report, they are concerned about retaliation from China. For a lot of these countries, particularly in Europe and in Asia, China's their largest trading partner. And so they do need to be worried about that. At the same time, the only way that we're going to reduce the effectiveness of this tactic is to work together. Basically, the idea of working together and bringing as many friends to the fight as you can. So if we combine our economic leverage between the United States and Europe and major Asian allies, I think that's the only way we're going to be able to push back on this trend from China.
You know, a drawback, though, is that the extra coordination with other countries will slow down the response time. Do you see that as a disadvantage?
It's true that it might slow things down, but we're looking at a problem that is systemic and structural and will persist for years and decades to come. And so I would argue that that little bit of extra time to make sure that we have an effective and durable response, and one that China knows will be coming as we play this game over and over again, is ultimately the better response, even if it does take us a little bit longer to get our act together in the beginning.
You also recommend bound engagement, where American actions are constrained within domestic and international rules and norms. Doesn't that put the U.S. at a disadvantage since China isn't bound by those rules?
It's a good question, but look, I mean, the United States has a strategic interest in stability and predictability in the global economy and the international trading system. And so when we are engaging in coercive economic statecraft, or when we're responding to economic coercion from China, we should be doing so in a way that supports rather than undermines that stability and predictability of the trading system. And it's also worth keeping in mind that economic coercion is just one piece of the broader economic relationship that we're trying to manage with China. We need to get a functioning WTO up and running. We need to have a rules-based trading system in the Pacific region where the United States is working with its partners to set rules and norms. And so if we're trying to achieve that, but at the same time breaking those rules and norms, that's not going to be a very effective strategy over the long term.
At the same time, Emily, are there economic tools that China can use that the U.S. can't use?
We've certainly seen that, and this is what we refer to in our report as off-book measures. mean, we have to keep in mind that China's economy is a state-controlled economy. They have all the levers over their economy. They can do these things like off-book measures is what we call them in the reports. They can organize commercial boycotts of brands like H&M who are criticizing human rights practices. They can just have Lithuania disappear from their customs registry and block imports and exports in a very kind of clever off-book manner. The United States doesn't do that. We are an open economy with limited restrictions, and any restrictions that we do place on trade and investment are done based on rule of law democratic principles. So that's a clear distinction between how the United States and China does this. But I wouldn't argue that China's way is better or more effective. Ultimately, I think it's a destabilizing impact and will decrease the commercial attractiveness of their market.
Well, you do say that persuasive rather than coercive tactics will improve the U.S.'s negotiating position. Explain why, because China uses coercive tactics, so why shouldn't the U.S.?
Yeah, it's a distinction between who we're trying to coerce, right? I mean, so we clearly are and will be using some coercive tactics against China. But we also need to make sure that we're not inadvertently coercing our allies, who we need to have on our side in order to have an accessible strategy for pushing back on China. So when we say we should be using persuasion, it's really just keeping in mind the sensitivity of our allies and making sure that we are consulting and coordinating with them up front when we're developing strategies and implementing strategies to push back against China.
All right. Well, Emily, thanks very much for being on the program. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on any future Government Matters interviews.